Hello, everyone, and welcome to a production from HospitalityLawyer.com regarding fentanyl. Today is March 24th, 2023. Our comments today are our own, and they are not to be imputed to any organization with which we might be affiliated. Please take just a moment and read through this disclaimer before continuing on with the video. In a nutshell, we are not providing you legal advice. We are doing our best to provide you information, insight, and education. Fentanyl. There were over 107,000 drug overdoses that resulted in death in the United States in 2021. Of those 107,000, 2/3, 67 or so thousand of those deaths were caused by fentanyl. Let's meet our panel of experts. Joining us today is Mr. Brad Bonnell, principal of the Hotel Security Group in Alpharetta, Georgia. Brad is the former global director of security for IHG Hotels. He was involved in developing their security and programs and implementing their security programs for over 4,500 units in over 100 countries. Prior to that, Brad had a significant career in law enforcement with the Georgia State Patrol. He has a broad range of security expertise and experience in fraud investigations, security threat analysis, and he's also highly sought after as an expert witness in hotel security matters. Joining Brad today is Sherri Foster, Director of Safety and Security at Extended Stay America Management, based in Cedartown, Georgia. Sherri also brings a significant law enforcement and security background, also focusing on money laundering, fraud, violent crimes, and drug aspects of society. She's an expert in opioid poisoning cases, also in hotel security, as well as implementing and executing strategic policy for hotel security. She also spends a lot of her time focusing on trafficking investigations and cyber intelligence analysis. Joining Brad and Sherri is Mr. Sal Caccavale, Principal, Global Hospitality Security Solutions based in Phoenix, Arizona. Sal has spent his entire 35-year career with the Hilton organization focusing on safety and security. You can't go to a Hilton today without somebody involved in the security aspect of operating a Hilton hotel, not knowing Sal, or more importantly, probably being under his tutelage to learn how to develop security policies and to implement them for the safety and security of guests. Joining Brad and Sherri and Sal, Mr. Marshall Gilinsky, shareholder at Anderson Kill, based out of Boston, but affiliated with the New York office. Marshall practices along with his partners at Anderson Kill in insurance recovery and corporate and commercial litigation. They represent policy holders like hotel owners to recover what rightfully they're entitled to under their insurance policies. They assist with consulting with organizations about the best coverages to purchase, and of course, establishing the right types of claims, and if need be, pursuing claims against insurance companies that wrongfully deny coverage and payments. My name is Stephen Barth. I will be the moderator today. I'm the founder of HospitalityLawyer.com, a professor at the Conrad N. Hilton College of Global Hospitality Leadership at the University of Houston. Again, our comments and remarks today are our own. They are not to be imputed to any organization with which we might be affiliated. Let's get started. What is fentanyl? It's a synthetic opioid. Why it's so dangerous? 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. Typically, it's used to treat pain in cancer patients historically, but as we've all learned, it has been diverted for abuse. It is added to heroin to increase its potency, sometimes, often today, without people not knowing. Today, it's also added to many other types of drugs, cocaine, marijuana, etc. It's produced most frequently in Mexico. And as we've learned from the news, sadly and tragically, it often results in overdose deaths. It has no taste or smell, so it's very difficult to detect. It can also be absorbed through the skin, which is why it's so dangerous and we need to know about it. 2 milligrams can be fatal. People take fentanyl in a variety of ways. It can be sold as a powder, dropped on a blotter paper, which is the image with the square on the tongue, and it gets absorbed into the trunk, by the tongue. Eyedroppers, nasal sprays, and or pills. Often, doctors prescribe patches, lozenges, or injections, but those also can be utilized for illicit use as well. So I'd like to start our discussion by asking Sherri to talk to us about why fentanyl is so dangerous.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Well, there's many reasons why fentanyl is so dangerous. The number one reason is you do not have to take a lot of it. Just a grain of it can kill you. It is the most potent drug that I've ever seen in my 39-year career. The other reason it's dangerous is because the traffickers are packaging it in a way to deceive us. They will make them look like a pill press. They can make it look like a regular oxycodone, which is a drug that is prescribed by doctors for pain. Any color you can imagine, they call them Roxy 30s, blue pills, whatever. But the fact is they're disguising it. And so someone can take it thinking they're taking an actual oxycodone pill, hydrocodone pill, and they're actually taking fentanyl.
And so the lacing is kind of pervasive today. Is that a fair way to say it, Sherri?
Absolutely. In the beginning, we saw heroin mixed with fentanyl because both of those are opioids. They're both depressants, if you will. Now, the game has changed. They are mixing it with, they being the traffickers or the dealers are mixing it with cocaine, methamphetamine. They're lacing marijuana with it. So there are no rules anymore in the drug game.
Wow. All right. And on this next slide, to your point, they're even making it look attractive.
I mean, they're great marketers, but the sad thing is they're marketing a drug that will kill you. I mean, make no mistake about it. This is a fatal drug. This is a poison that has permeated our society because of these kind of pills. They're attractive, they're pretty. I think they call them rainbow fentanyl, I believe it is, because they go in any color that you can imagine. And the sad thing is it's very attractive to children.
That is tragic, and you're right about that. Well, on this next slide, We show you what the effects are on the body. You can see them: nausea and vomiting, confusion, reduced blood pressure, dizziness. But we've emphasized the word death because, as Sherri just pointed out, often, more often than not, in these cases today, with the lacing of these other drugs, we're seeing these overdoses result in death. And then, to Sherri's point on this next slide, you might not often even hear the word fentanyl. As Sherri pointed out, China Grill, China White, Great Bear, right? They have not just made different colors of these pills, they're giving them names to kind of promote them to the user population. Yeah, it's sad. Now let's take a moment and let's look at the risks related to fentanyl, particularly, Sherri, when we start mixing it with opioids or even alcohol. Can you talk about that for just a moment?
Yeah, so fentanyl by itself is a synthetic opioid that is extremely dangerous. It was started, I think, in the 59, 60 time period. It became, when they created it, it was used as an intravenous anesthetic. It is used for cancer patients. The problem is that most of these people that are mixing the drugs and selling it, or the homemade chemists, if you will, they're putting other opioids in. It just exacerbates the effects that an opioid has on your body. There's an article that I read that said fentanyl can cause death. I would say that fentanyl will cause death. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. You can develop a tolerance, but at some point you're going to have that 1 gram over what you can take, your body can take, and it's going to lead to death.
Very helpful information. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to be mindful of this for yourselves, for your friends, your family, and at your hotel business. Let's take a look at the signs of a fentanyl or other opioid overdose. We've listed them for you here. Obviously, non-responsive, loss of consciousness, gurgling sounds. There's just a loss of ability to function, cold, clammy, or bluish skin. They start breathing in a shallow fashion. Pupils that start out very narrow, but then could become dilated quickly. So be on the lookout for those things. But that's important. But okay, so now we see the signs, but what do we do? Or we realize there's been an overdose. What do we do? On this next slide, we're going to talk about that. So Brad, Sal, Sherri, let's start with you though. What to do if you suspect an overdose? First thing.
Let me going back to the other slide. Understand that the effects of fentanyl are extremely quick. So it could be within a second, 30 seconds, 1 minute, whatever. So you have to be quick to recognize those symptoms. But when you do and you realize there's an overdose occurring, my suggestion is to call 911 immediately. Do not touch anything, and get out of the room if you're in a hotel room. But the main thing is to get the first responders on the scene as quickly as possible.
All right, and Sal and Brad. Brad, let's go with you. I just want to emphasize, as Sherri just did, we want to remind them not to touch anything in the room, correct? And can you talk about why not?
Absolutely correct, because you don't need another victim. If you have reason to suspect that you have a room that's contaminated with fentanyl, you have to get out of the room as quickly as you can. You're going to have to allow first responders that are properly equipped, properly trained to manage the situation from that point on. Last thing you want to do is make the situation worse by becoming a victim yourself.
Great insight. Okay, and so we've had some discussion lately about naloxone, which is a drug that can temporarily reverse the effects of an opioid overdose. But we know that cities are working and trying to get more people involved in having naloxone and having the ability to administer it. But I'd like to get Sal's thoughts about, Sal, I don't feel like this is pervasive in hotels yet. I think we have some examples, but are you seeing it as pervasive so far?
No, there are not a lot of hotels that are keeping naloxone in their first aid kits or at their front desk for emergency purposes. But there is coincidentally a town in Ohio 2 years ago or so, as a result of a youth who died of a fentanyl overdose. The city gave the 4 hotels within their own city naloxone kits, emergency kits. We don't know if there was a problem with these other 4 hotels where fentanyl or drug use was occurring. So we really don't have any statistics on what it looks like today versus what it looked like 2 years ago relative to the rescue of folks who are overdosing. There are some cities that are in discussion about making these requirements for hotels with naloxone, such as San Francisco. So it might be something that's coming down the road, but I think it's a little bit early.
I think that's a very good point. We bring this up now because we want you to be aware of it in case you are operating in a city that comes to you and encourages you to keep naloxone in your first aid kit and have available. So now you understand what it is. It's relatively simple to administer, but we encourage you to be trained, and or if you decide to keep it on the premises, we encourage you as well as your staff to be trained in it, what it is in a more detailed fashion, as well as how to administer it, not just in a safe way for the person that is OD'd, but for the person administering it as well, so there's not a cross-contamination effect. Well, on this next slide, let's talk about preventing fentanyl exposure. Sal, Brad, you guys have been in the industry forever. I know we've been trying to get housekeepers to wear gloves and safety glasses whenever they're performing their duties or entering a guest room. How important it is today with this fentanyl situation going on that housekeepers routinely glove up and wear their glasses when entering guest rooms. Sal, let's start with you.
Well, it's an OSHA requirement that the housekeepers wear the approved gloves, personal protective equipment, as well as the goggles for the chemicals that they're using. So it's not optional; they have to wear it. But to your point, yeah, we're probably a little lax in getting our housekeepers to wear this personal protective equipment, but it's mandatory. It's not a discussion.
Brad, do you feel the same way?
Absolutely. I think that the threat of fentanyl is conspicuous, and it goes to the issue of, did we know or should we have known of a threat, and did we act appropriately to mitigate that threat? Fentanyl should make for all housekeepers, it makes it mandatory for them to wear gloves and eyewear, eye safety equipment for their own safety. Again, there's just, I think years ago we became a little complacent about the OSHA requirements, about the PPE and the gloves, but that was before fentanyl. Fentanyl has changed the landscape, and I think if you want to protect your housekeepers, if you care about your housekeepers, you're going to make them wear the gloves. You're going to make them wear the eyewear, and you're going to make them understand and make them sensitive to this threat, and that they have a responsibility to protect themselves as well as their coworkers.
All fair points. Well, on this next slide, let's talk just for a moment. I just want you to be aware that if you do get contaminated, you want to immediately, with lots of water, wash it away as best you can. And then with soap and water as well, but do not use alcohol-based hand disinfectants or heavy bleach solutions, as they can enhance the skin absorption of fentanyl. So we all got used to using these alcohol-based hand disinfectants during COVID, but that's not the best practice when you're trying to decontaminate if you were accidentally exposed to fentanyl. And listen, this happens. There was a matter in Florida not too long ago where a young child was exposed to fentanyl that was left by a shared stay property, not a hotel, but a shared stay property. And they believe that the child was exposed to the fentanyl probably from the countertop that was in the property even after it had been cleaned. So we're going to talk about the extent of cleaning and remediation that needs to occur. Let's look ahead just a little bit on this next slide and we'll get to that. So just as a reminder, if you're using your PPE, which as you heard from the safety and security experts, you always should be, and your housekeeping teams and maintenance people should always be using their PPE. Make sure you are careful when decontaminating your PPE should anything be exposed to fentanyl. Now let's take a look in this next slide about cleaning up and remediation. Brad, every health department in the city, we don't have consistent policies and procedures. How important is it that each innkeeper establishes a relationship with the local health department, and particularly their policies and procedures around remediating a hotel room that's had a fentanyl exposure?
Steve, is critical because it has become a common and reasonably accepted practice in hotel security, hospitality security, that if you have any reason to believe that a guest room has been contaminated with any controlled substance, you take that room out of service, you report it to your insurance carrier, and you notify the local health authority, and you obtain a new certificate of occupancy for that room. To simply go in and try to deep clean the room yourself is never going to be a defensible policy, because we in the hospitality industry are not trained professionals in contamination remediation. We should know the expectations of the local health board, the governing health authority. We should establish a relationship with them, and we need to be acting proactively so we know what their expectations are. So if we have an incident, we can simply get in front of it right away, collaborate with your local health authority. Do not take that risk of putting a contaminated room back in your inventory. It's not worth it.
Yeah, great points. And Sal, so that, to Brad's point, not only do we need relationships with law enforcement, which we always talk about, not only do we need to understand the local health department policies and procedures, but how crucial is it that we have a prior relationship with a professional remediation company in your experience?
Well, you don't want to meet your remediation company as you wouldn't want to meet your local police officer during an emergency situation. You want to have that relationship established long prior to ever utilizing their services under emergent conditions, particularly with a remediation company. And not all remediation companies are necessarily licensed to go into a room that was tainted with some sort of drugs or being used as a drug lab or just as an overdose, a one-time type of thing. There are specific OSHA rules that require a remediation company to be credentialed. And it's a 40-hour class for each of the remediation employees to attend, so that they understand the dynamic and how to properly clean that room in a safe manner.
So I think, Sal, what we're saying is they should, when I'm looking for that remediation company, I should look for a certification. I should look for a license to remediate for these types of substances. Is that a fair recap?
That's spot on, and do it sooner rather than later. Establish that
Soon.
relationship.
Okay, you heard it here first. Brad, I want to come back to you now because I know you've had some experience with this. As the next bullet says on this slide, it can be pricey. And so we're going to talk about insurance in just a bit, but can you give the viewers a ballpark of what it's going to cost to remediate one of these rooms where an overdose or a death occurs due to fentanyl or some similar substance, and why it's so expensive?
Our recent experience with fentanyl contamination remediation is averaging $30,000. If you have a room where fentanyl has been manufactured or it has determined that it has saturated the room, it'll be as much as $50,000 per incident. We've had situations where not only have we had to remove the carpet and the textile products, we've had to remove the drywall, as well as all of the case goods. So between $30,000 and $50,000 per event is not uncommon.
Thanks, gentlemen. Okay, now, because it's so expensive, and Brad, just to be clear, we often have to remove curtains, carpet, mattresses, right? I mean, it's almost like it's a bed bug situation, but it can be even worse. So because it can stick around. So sometimes even just a professional cleaning isn't going to do the trick. Is that fair?
That is correct. It's not worth the risk. I think as some subsequent slides will inform, it's a very difficult thing to eradicate totally. And you have to go through a series of testing during the remediation process to demonstrate that you removed every single trace, because it takes such a small amount to be fatal. So it's not like removing a bag of marijuana from a hotel guest room. It's much more contentious. It's much more difficult to ensure that you have provided your guests with a reasonably safe room.
It's a lot to think about. Thank you both for that. That's terrific. And so since we talked about how much it can be and checking with your insurance carrier, I'd like to turn now on this next slide. Visiting with Marshall Gilinsky of Anderson Kill. Marshall, we've been visiting here about fentanyl overdoses and deaths, and the subject around the cost of remediation or cleaning the room to get it back into service and in the hotel room inventory has come up, because we've heard anecdotes that it can cost sometimes $25,000, $30,000, even up to $40,000, because with the powder from these drugs, particularly fentanyl, it being so powerful that if it's on the drapes, if it's in the carpet, if it gets on the case goods or the countertops, the bedding, all of that has to be removed, because we haven't determined yet if there's an effective cleaning process for that. So the practice, as we understand, has been to remove those things, and that's why the cost has been so expensive. And of course, you've got to pass typically a health department, the health department guidelines in order to get a certificate of occupancy commonly issued to put the room back in service. So the question that has come up is, since it's become this pricey, is there a potential for a recovery under an insurance policy for the innkeeper for these remediation expenses?
Yeah, well, most policies, Steve, cover situations where there's physical loss or damage to your property, and where you have a dangerous substance in a room, that typically would constitute physical loss or damage to property. If there's if it's something that could be cleaned up without significant cost, spilled wine or something like that, then that's something that obviously you wouldn't turn to insurance for. You would just deal with it. But if the cost is extraordinary and the need to do it is real, then yeah, I think it's fair to say that that property suffered physical loss or damage. and it needs to be rectified, and that's what insurance is for. The question arises, though, from probably most hoteliers, what's the deductible under your policy? If you've got a cost to spend $20,000-$30,000 to remediate a room, that is probably within the deductible of most policies. So you're not going to have real insurance response to that loss unless it's affecting a number of rooms at the same time, which probably isn't the case.
That's very helpful. And we learned a lot about physical damage to property during COVID, didn't we?
Yeah. So, and that's been a fascinating exercise as well. And you can see a similarity there, right? Insurance companies were saying, COVID's not a problem. You just let it be and it goes away, right? Now, I completely disagree with that argument. I don't think that's true, especially with respect to the operations of hotels. But I don't think they would even say that with respect to a dangerous substance like fentanyl that's in a room. Just leaving it there, it does not solve the problem. You need to do something to make that room safe for use again. And that's what insurance is there to respond to.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And ladies and gentlemen, just to be clear, to emphasize, you need to undertake a significant remediation. And recall the discussion where you need to think about if there's bodily fluids or some other type of significant contamination from the overdose or the death, that you need a very specialized biohazard type removal team to come in and remediate the room. So that's something to keep in mind, and that can get very costly. So hopefully this conversation with Marshall is very helpful. But Marshall, at the very least, I should contact my broker and advise them of this situation. Shouldn't I do that? Because I don't, at the time it happens, I don't know what it's going to cost me at that time. Is that a fair way to look at it?
I think it's a sensible response, right? You want to understand what do I need to do to make this room safe? How much is that going to cost? And then from there, the question of insurance fits side by side there. What does my insurance cover? And what's the deductible that applies?
That's great. And I know you guys at Anderson Kill do a lot of work on the risk management side of things. Of course, that's your business representing policyholders. So here's the question that we'll wrap up with, Marshall. So I know I've had a drug overdose, right? Why would I want to spend the money to clean it up extensively and appropriately, in an instance like this?
It's just a basic risk management principle, right? And this isn't about insurance as much as it is hotel operations. You want to make sure that your property is safe and attractive to your customers. And if you know you have a problem, if all you know is there's a tragedy in a room, you want to make that room safe and usable for guests in the future. If it happens to be a drug overdose, then there's this added layer of risk, and it makes sense to take appropriate steps to make sure that the conditions in the room after you've addressed it are safe for future guests.
Thanks, Marshall. Very helpful information. All right, ladies and gentlemen, now let's turn to this next slide. Let's talk about just a little bit about how, since it is so pricey, we're really incentivized to prevent overdoses from occurring. Now, we talked about naloxone, also known as Narcan, just so everybody's familiar with that term. But what we haven't talked about is the availability of fentanyl test strips, which users can use to determine, as Sherri pointed out, that it's this illicit lacing of these other drugs with fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, etc., that is making it so dangerous. And there's no way for the user to know if the fentanyl is included with the other drug, and if so, how much. So these test strips enable the user to determine the level of fentanyl in what they're getting ready to take. it's something cities are looking at carefully to determine if it's something they want to utilize and make more pervasive. We want you to be aware of this testing concept in case, again, the city comes to you and or your hotel is being used for housing for people that perhaps from the VA patients or other rehab type situations, that you will be informed as to what these are, just like we wanted you to be informed about naloxone. But guys, let's also talk about do not rent policies, right? Every hotel I know from time to time has some folks, and sometimes many folks, on a do not rent policy because of some sort of prior situation that has occurred. Brad, how important is it that we document that that list is actually in writing and that we talk about the reason for inclusion on that list?
It's critical because your do not rent list is going to enable you to demonstrate that you have enforced a policy, whether it's a policy against prostitution, sex trafficking, human trafficking, or drug trafficking. It shows that you are controlling your hotel, that you're not turning a blind eye to antisocial behavior. But all too often, the do not rent list does not detail the reason someone was evicted or denied registration. The do not rent list basically indicates you evicted someone and you're not going to allow them back onto property. Now, different hotels have different reasons, but I can tell you your a comprehensive do not rent report is going to be critical as evidence during a premise security liability lawsuit, because it is, for the most part, the only evidence that hotels are generating demonstrating that they are enforcing their policies and procedures. You've got to have the policies, you've got to have the training, but if you don't have evidence of enforcement, then you've weakened your ability to demonstrate that you've met your duty of care.
Very good point. I hope everybody takes that to heart. In this next bullet, people ask all the time, can we have a no locals policy? Because often we found that precluding the renting of our rooms from the local area can prevent a lot of illicit activity from occurring at the hotel. But you have to be extra cautious about crafting your no locals policy. I suggest that it's a radius around the hotel so that it intersects with all demographics in your community, and so that we're not having a disparate impact, in other words, illegally discriminating against a particular protected class, and that we consistently enforce that policy. You need to be extra cautious if you are making exceptions to your no locals policy. Sal, you've been at this a long time. How crucial have your relationships with law enforcement been in your career?
The relationship that you have, not only with law enforcement, but we talked earlier, the boards of health, fire rescue, EMS, you have to maintain these relationships, and you have to get in to know these folks on a personal basis. When you establish a friendship, not just a working relationship, when you establish that relationship with law enforcement, fire, EMS, board of health, et cetera, you're going to get that service much quicker. And you might get that intimate detail that other hotels down the street who don't have that relationship, they won't get that.
Good guidance, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you take that to heart. He's sharing with you that it's worth the time and investment in getting to know these folks. They're there to support you. I know sometimes you feel differently and we get a little jaded or cynical, but Sal's been doing this a long time. Take it to heart. So on this next slide, as we know, sometimes these overdoses result in death. Now, we've given you the thoughts, if your employee discovers it, don't touch anything back out of the room. But now we've got a death, and that adds a little more to the situation. Sal, I think the suggestion is we need to be familiar with our local health department guidelines and procedures for remediation. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. And for remediation, there really isn't much in there in federal guidelines or state guidelines to really determine how to clean up a room when it was involved with drug labs. So in many cases, you're going to see the local health departments preparing their own plans. So it's important that if you are in one city and now move to another city, as hoteliers often do, you have to become familiar with those local health department rules and laws.
This is both to Brad and Sal. Brad, you first, but whenever we have a death, do we need to call the police every time there's a death?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. Get professional guidance, get a determination. We shouldn't be in that business.
Absolutely. It's going to be critical that the minute you have reason to believe that a guest has been injured, is dead, immediately notify the local authorities, step back, give that to them, let them assume responsibility for it.
Very helpful. And Brad, when there's a death on the property or a significant injury or overdose, it doesn't just impact the person that has died or injured, right? It can be traumatic for other guests and other employees. We need to be mindful of that. Is that fair?
That's absolutely correct. Do not underestimate the psychological impact and the emotional impact on your line level associates, who are the people who often encounter these situations, have to deal with these situations. Oftentimes the family members of the deceased come to the hotels, and those are the folks that oftentimes have to interact with family members. It is something that needs to be recognized as a threat and a risk to your staff. It's imperative that you make available to them whatever services you can in the form of an employee assistance program, whether it's psychological counseling. I believe that most insurance carriers will recommend this. Hotel insurance carriers will recommend this, will advise you on this. The cost is minimal. It's a very small price to pay to offer your associates the benefit of psychological counseling, to you yourself know what to advise them, to tell them if suddenly they are experiencing loss of appetite, irritability, inability to sleep. They keep flashing back on that moment when they went into the guest room and they saw the deceased, that they need to recognize that those are symptoms of a very common form of post-traumatic stress that can be treated and should be treated. If you lose an employee because you did not extend this benefit, then you haven't made a very smart business decision, because it costs a great deal of money to replace someone, to train someone, but more importantly, let them know that you care about them. We get close, particularly in the economy sector, the extended stay sector, we get close to our guests, we know them. If an employee is injured or killed, it can have a very dramatic effect on the emotional stability of your organization. It is demoralizing. You need to recognize that as part of the risk that you have to mitigate.
And Brad, to your point, I would say add a grief counseling company to your lists, put them in your Rolodex, get to know them in advance, just like you would law enforcement, EMS, fire, et cetera. If your corporate flag doesn't already have a relationship or a retainer with a grief counseling firm, reach out to your insurance carrier and see if they can recommend one. Again, grief counseling is something that you want to implement immediately after the situation.
And again, let me stress, this is a common practice in hospitality, to provide your line level associates with this sort of support.
Yeah, that's great guidance. And look, if you're having trouble, if you're young and you don't know what a Rolodex is, just Google it. And we'll make sure you fix it up. I want to get Sherri back in on this next slide. Sherri, we're hearing that, you know, like we talked about earlier, VA patients are being housed in hotels, but we're also seeing just individuals, instead of going to rehabilitation centers, sometimes it can be cheaper to go into a hotel. Are you seeing that as kind of a more of a popular practice that's going on out in society?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's not just, you know, the housing market the way it is. There's not many apartments. Extended stay, we actually see people dropping off their elderly parents because they're cheaper than assisted living homes. And elderly parents that may have medical issues, but there's a lot of programs that put people in our hotels, which is absolutely fine. The problem is that we're not always aware of the issues that they may be facing.
And that they bring to the hotel and the other guests and employees. Such a good point. Ladies and gentlemen, it's challenging to be in the hotel business. We know it is. We commend all of you for your courage and your perseverance. We hope you've taken some insights away from this presentation with references that were used to develop the information on this video, should you wish to do more research and follow up on your own. I would like to thank our panelists. We could not have done it without you, Sherri, Brad, Sal, Marshall. Thank you very much for your expertise and your insight today. Very helpful. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Let us know if there are other topics you would like to hear about by contacting us at one of the social handles listed here, or you can also contact us at HospitalityLawyer.com at any time. Thank you again. Until next time.